Hi, welcome everyone to this session. I can promise it's going to be a very interesting one, and because usually we find that at least in Pakistan, the CSO movement does not make these intersectional linkages between IFIs, international finance institutions, IMF, World Bank, and with our social development issues. I'll talk a little bit about the Ubuntu Symposium. It's the Men Engage alliances in various parts of the world, various countries. Networks came up after 2007, and initially the movement began after 1992, the ICPD Cairo, where for the first time, engaging men for gender equality, mainly for reproductive health and GBV was mentioned. So initially, a lot of work happened around engaging men and boys on GBV. Today, there are over 43 countries where there are country networks, over 700 NGOs. Then the countries come together in a regional network, and then the regional networks make the global, network. So now at the moment, there are over approximately 700 NGOs from all over the world in this. This symposium is the third one in the series. There were two previous ones, and the last one in Delhi about 6 years ago was really where thousands of people came together and linkages with feminist, organizations and feminist activists were made very strongly at that time. So really the purpose of the this, is number one, really to see where we are going with our efforts as a group, but also strengthen linkages with feminist organizations, because all the work that Men Engage Alliance members do is feminist informed. And we feel that we are very strongly accountable to women's movement all over the world, and keep trying to make alliances with feminist organizations. So this symposium has been a space for reflection, but also strategizing on how to move forward. And this session is, an effort towards that. In terms of, I'll stop there. In terms of, a little more information around this. Please, this session is being recorded, because then we may want to, develop a paper, put it on Men Engage, global website, or our own, regional website. And I would request all of you to keep jotting your questions in the chat, because somebody, Charlotte actually, is monitoring the chat, and she'll keep telling us where there are interesting ideas during Q&A where we want to respond. And if we are at the moment we are 15, so it's good if we can also keep 16 now anyway. So it will be good if we can have a good dialogue and chat after the presentation. So over to Constanza, because she's moderating this session. Thank you, Constanza. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Bilquis. And hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And thank you again to Bilquis, Men Engage, and the symposium organizers for bringing us together today. My name is Constanza Pauchulo. I am a program officer coordinating the Transforming Economics and Development Through a Feminist Approach program at International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, or IWRAW Asia Pacific for short. And I'll be the moderator today. So very excited to be a part of this symposium on engaging men and boys on gender equality. And of course, gender equality affects everyone. Everyone has a gender identity. So understanding the role of macro level economic policies and institutions in maintaining or deepening gender inequalities and unequal gender power relations is important for all social justice and human rights work. And in particular, understanding how capitalist and neoliberal economic structures work through patriarchy, racism, white supremacy, ableism, and other forms of oppression to maintain a world where very few benefit and thrive at the expense of the majority of people, nature, and non-human beings is again central to seeing transformative systemic change across our various areas of work and really making these kinds of connections, dismantling these systems and creating a new world is what feminist economic justice is all about. So thank you again for being here and engaging with us. We're very lucky to have all of you here, and I know people are from various backgrounds and areas of expertise. So the presentations themselves will really be an introduction, setting kind of a common ground on feminist macro level economics and why it matters. And then, as Bilquis said, we hope to really deepen the discussion during the Q&A by hearing from all of you and learning from all of you as well. So we thought we'd start with a short clip from a video that IWRAW Asia Pacific developed coming out of a meeting in 2019 on gender equality and macroeconomics. And the video is called Breaking Silos, Building Movements, which I think aptly describes the contribution we're hoping to all make here today as our first step in working together. So here we go. Bear with me as I share my screen.
From the food we eat, to the roads we travel, and to the houses that we live in, every part of our lives and the struggle for gender equality is impacted by economic policies. The push for unrestrained economic growth has worsened gender, racial, and class inequalities around the world and weakened our government's ability to fulfill their human rights obligations. In December 2019, International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific convened a meeting of women's rights advocates and policy experts to understand how global economic and development structures impact the daily lives of women. The meeting revealed a common feminist vision focused on the redistribution of power, democratization of economic decisions, and control over economic resources at all levels: local, national, regional, and global. The devastating fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic for women across the globe, and especially those in marginalized groups in the global south, has highlighted the urgency of this vision for a global economic model that puts people and planet first. This video is an invitation to collaborate in that vision.
So welcome back. I think that last line really captures our intention here today, which is to say that the session itself is also an invitation to collaborate in that vision of feminist economic justice. And so with that, I think it's a perfect time to turn it over to our first speaker, Sophie Efange, who will be giving us an introduction into feminist macro level economics. Sophie is a Black feminist of Ethiopian and Cameroonian heritage and is the policy manager at Gender and Development Network a UK-based membership organization for NGOs, academics, and development practitioners working to put gender equality and women's rights at the heart of international development discourse and practice. And Sophie, maybe you can start us off with a common question that we'll be putting to all the speakers, or I will be putting to all the speakers, which is telling us one word or phrase that comes to mind when you hear macroeconomics and women's rights. Over to you.
Thank you, Connie, for that introduction, and thank you also, Bilquis, for inviting me to this session. And if to kick off really on your starting question about what's the one word that I think about when I think of macroeconomic policy and when I think of gender inequality, the one word for me is power. And hopefully this is something that I'll be able to discuss as part of my presentation, but will also be picked up in the presentations that will follow as well. Hi everyone. As Connie said, my name is Sophie Efange, and so what I want to do today is, kick off the presentations by talking about the gendered nature of our national and global economies. And a lot of the content that I'm going to cover today is actually discussed in a little bit more detail, because we only have a few minutes each to speak, in an introductory guide to feminist economics, which was produced by my organization Gaddon and an African network of feminists called Femnet. And this collective work also includes a lot of thinking and knowledge that has been developed by many African feminists. So I would definitely encourage you to check it out when you've got a chance, especially once you've had an ability to watch the video that was just shared. Definitely worth reading through the pack. So thank you, Connie, for putting the link in the chat box. So I have a presentation. So Connie, if you could share the first slide of my presentation, that would be really great. So just to discuss, as I mentioned, what I'm hoping to cover in my initial bit before I pass on to the other speakers is an introduction to what is macro level economics, and really importantly, why is it a women's rights issue? Something that for a really long time has been considered not related to one another, and also what or who makes decisions about how our economies work, where these decisions are made, and how they are made. So those are the two kind of key things that I hope to address first and foremost. So if we move on to the next slide, I have Connie posed a question for me about what word I think of when I think of gender equality and macro level economics, but I want to pose that question almost back to you as the audience. So we've got a very quick poll that I would like you to do. So in the chat box, there should be a link to a poll that is asking you to identify 3 words that you would use to describe our global economy. So I hope everybody's got a chance to access that link. And if you can just quickly fill that in now, and I'll give everyone a minute to think of what 3 words you would use to describe the global economy. If you can't think of 3, that's fine. 1 word will do. So yes. Thank you, Charlotte. She's put the link in the poll, the link to the poll in the chat box. So please have a look now, and we'll give it 1 minute for everyone to fill in their answers. It can also be a phrase if you would prefer, a short answer, or you might not have thought about it at all up until now. So feel free to put in "don't know" if that is the case. So I hope that has given everybody a chance to have an initial thought, at least, about what words they would use to describe our global economy. And if I can, Connie, ask you to perhaps share on the screen the results of that of the poll, just so that we can get an idea about what others are thinking in response to that. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Connie. So yes. So let's wait for the answers to start populating. So maybe if you refresh the screen, Connie. Okay, I've got it. Okay, there we go. So as you can see, these are some of the answers that you've come up with. Complicated, unequal, resource used, and clearly exploitative is one that appears to be a recurring one across all of you. Unsustainable, unfair, governance, broken, And these are really, apt ways of being able to understand the nature of our global economy. In a little bit, we'll go into explaining how this is all by design and not by chance that the economy happens to be extremely exploitative, unfair, unequal, resource-driven, etc. So thanks very much, Connie. And if we can go back to the PowerPoint presentation, I'm asking you to be very dexterous. And go back. Yes, so great. So if we move on to the next PowerPoint presentation, the next slide, I think it's really important to start off with what is macro level economics, first and foremost, in order to understand the context of this session, why we're trying to link up macro level economics with gender equality. And the first thing I think that's really important to stress is that there's always an assumption that macro level economics is super technical, it's very complicated, and it's really something that should be left to old rich white men to figure out. But I think it's really important to stress that this is clearly not the case. So put very, very simply, macro level economics, it's the study of the economy as a whole or on an international level. But most importantly, it's about how governments make decisions about how to raise or spend money, which ends up having a really big impact on the everyday lives of people, and particularly women and girls. So it's an important way also for governments to plan how they will resource the rights of all of their citizens, so obviously women and girls included. But critically, as I mentioned right at the beginning, in response to Connie's question about the one word that I would use to describe the linkages between gender equality and macro level economics, is this question about political choice and power. So all macro level economic decision making is about political choices. They aren't just natural decisions. They are very deliberate, intended decisions that have been taken by those with power to decide how our economies should be shaped, how they should function. So if we move on to the next slide, it's to this question about why is macro level economics a women's rights issue? So I might go as far as saying, I guess, that the majority of you in this audience are certainly interested in or work directly on women's rights issues or issues on gender inequality, and certainly the role that men have in advancing this cause, gender equality, that is. And as many of you will have certainly witnessed over the last year with COVID, it's really highlighted as well as exacerbated existing gender inequalities, with women really having to shoulder a lot of the impacts of the pandemic. And if we think of things like in the home with additional caring responsibilities, for elderly, for the sick, for children, a loss of informal work as a result of a lot of the national lockdowns that were announced, but also not forgetting, the rise of this shadow pandemic through increased incidences of violence against women and girls, which has also resulted in limited access to sexual reproductive health and rights services. So, I mean, it's a myriad of issues that has really been highlighted by this pandemic. So in response to a lot of these issues that we've seen that have come out from the pandemic, and certainly from historically as well, there have been really large-scale protests from both women and men all across the world, really campaigning, for example, on things like women's universal rights to access to abortion services, which was a real issue, for example, across Latin America, or across southern parts of Africa, where you have women and men protesting about the violence that women are experiencing domestically in the home. And certainly, there are other kinds of protest movements as well that not necessarily are tied to the pandemic, but really raise issues like girls' rights to education through, Malala Yousafzai's campaign, but also other issues. So if you look at the issues of sexual reproductive health and rights, violence against women and girls' education, these are all kind of core issues that require resources, that require money to be realized. And not just during a global pandemic, but more generally. But I think the pandemic has really brought those issues to the forefront about how they're really under-resourced. They're not things that come to the attention of decision makers more generally. But critically, as I mentioned before, the decisions about which areas governments decide to spend money on, it's really a political one, and it's made by those with the money, with power, with access. which is why we're seeing governments spending huge amounts of money on things like military or on policing or repaying debts in the middle of a global pandemic. Yet there's often little to no money that is reserved for critical services like social protection, healthcare, education, as we have seen by many governments during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we move on to the next slide, Connie, it's really to kind of begin to explain the design of our current economy, and which, of course, it certainly is gendered. And as Connie mentioned right in the beginning, we have to be able to understand all the different systems of oppression that are in existence that help carve out and create our current global economy. And certainly issues of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, white supremacy have all helped shape all parts of our economy. So particularly through the distribution of wealth or the lack of a distribution of wealth, all the way to our modern day financial instruments, as well as the ideas we have about how we think about poor marginalized communities, especially in the global South. Those are all shaped or dictated by all of these oppressive structures, that Connie had also referenced in the beginning. And certainly over a period of over 300 years, we have seen European powers conquer and carve up large parts of the globe as a way to enhance their financial fortunes and increase their global influence. And certainly this has been the origins or the birth of our current modern day system of capitalism, the economic system that effectively drives our global economy and which sees workers exploited for the sole purpose of ensuring financial profit for the upper classes. So that's, if you like, the racialized nature of our economies, which leads me on to the issue of the gendered way in which our economies have evolved. And if you can move on to the next slide, Connie, this will require, what I want to be able to do is dive a little bit deeper in what is called the care economy in order to be able to understand or explain the gendered nature of our economies. So the care or reproductive economy, as it's also sometimes known, it relates to the huge amounts of unpaid care and domestic work within the household and across all of our communities, but is overwhelmingly done by women, as well as the paid care work like childcare, social care, nursing within the productive economy. Again, an area that is overwhelmingly done by women. But these are critical areas which our societies, anywhere you go across the world, which are instrumental for us to be able to function properly. And this has certainly been demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which, we've seen childcare, social care, healthcare, all of those kind of issues, which have been so important to being able to resolve the pandemic, they have come to the fore about what is really, really important. However, our capitalist economies really rely on, and we might even say free ride on, women's unpaid care burdens, which are the product of socially constructed gender roles, which where we especially, essentially expect women to be natural carers. So they should be in the household, taking care of children, providing domestic support, cleaning, cooking, looking after children. But there is no monetary value that is accorded to that work, although it is a core part of how our capitalist economies function, certainly for creating the next generation of workers, the next generation of the labor force. But if this work wasn't provided for free, governments would have to vastly increase the amount of money they spend on public services, or the economy would effectively grind to a halt. It would stop operating. So by way of demonstrating how critical this care economy or the reproductive economy is for how all of our societies function, really, really conservative estimates have said that it has been valued at approximately being $10 trillion per year, or 13% of total global GDP, this unpaid care work that women do predominantly women do within our economies. So even before COVID-19, I think we can safely say that women performed the overwhelming majority of unpaid care work within the household. And the pandemic, as we've seen, has increased these responsibilities from childcare, schooling, domestic work, as I mentioned, looking after the sick, the elderly. And again, it's women who are picking up this slack. But there's this belief that, women have all the time in the world, that, they don't have anything better to do, so they can fill in these gaps when governments retreat and don't provide these services. Yet this has a real impact on the ability of women to do their other work, their paid work, their nursing work, etc. So it really does have a knock-on effect on how we devalue care work and its importance. So, and also, just to conclude, when women go on filling these unpaid care gaps, it really hides the true cost of how much it costs to take care of children, how much it costs to provide healthcare services, social care services. It completely and utterly masks that, which is really an indication of how gender blind our economies are, the ways in which they've evolved and developed. And those are deliberate decisions that have been made by decision makers, predominantly men. And that has, as I mentioned, a knock-on effect on the ways in which our economies work and function. So I think I'll stop there, and I hope that's given you a really small flavor about how our economies are designed, and hopefully Ella can lay out some of the institutional structures that have been instrumental really in this design. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was really engaging and helpful, and I think you managed to cover a lot of ground while really getting to the crux of why macro-level economics matters for women's human rights and gender equality. So thank you again. And our next speaker, Ella Hopkins, will help us narrow our focus and start applying the analysis Sophie took us through by looking specifically at the IMF and how these issues play out in their work. Ella is the Senior Gender Project Officer for the Bretton Woods Project, a UK-based watchdog of the IMF and the World Bank, with a particular focus on the impact of the two institutions' policies and activities on the environment, human rights, and democratic governance. Ella works on the Gender Equality and Macroeconomics Project, which challenges the ways in which macroeconomic policies currently promoted by the IMF and World Bank undermine gender equality and women's rights. So Ella, if you could start with the same question, what is one word or phrase that comes to mind when you hear macroeconomics and women's rights? Over to you.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Constanza, and great to be in this session, excited for the discussion. I think the word I would use is injustice, or on the flip side, justice. I think it's quite a useful framing for thinking about women's rights in the economy, and thinking about economic justice rather than women's economic empowerment, which is a term we often hear. Gender equality can sort of only happen when women have equal access to and control over resources and equal participation and influencing in economic decision making. And that to me is what economic justice means. So that's my word. Today I'm going to talk a bit about the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and its role in the global economy, its approach to gender and how it undermines women's rights. So if you wouldn't mind just getting the slideshow up when you get a chance. And as Sophie was just speaking, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is really key to influencing the global economic system, which Sophie just laid out and described in more detail. So firstly, just what does the IMF do? Well, it's the international organization tasked with maintaining global economic growth and stability. Oh, wonderful, thank you. So if we just go to the next slide, that'd be great. And it's known as the lender of last resort. So when all else fails, countries that are experiencing economic issues turn to it for support. And it lends them money. It influences almost every government on their economic policies through lending. So when it lends to countries, it often has conditions of different economic policies that countries must meet in order to get the money. Something called surveillance, which is basically policy advice that the IMF gives to countries. And though this isn't binding and attached to money, because of their role and their huge influence, countries often don't have much of a choice in terms of adopting this advice, particularly low and middle income countries. And then it also does technical assistance. So 3 things: lending, surveillance, and technical assistance. It's a public institution, which means it should be accountable to the countries that make up its membership, which is almost every country in the world. But it's been criticized for many years for not adequately engaging with civil society groups, not being accountable, having its decision-making skewed in favor of rich countries who have a lot more sway over the decisions that happen at the IMF, and also undermining countries' own sovereignty and their ability of national governments to make their own policy choices. And then the policies that it promotes itself are often policies which create more inequality and are harmful to women. So most typically, these policies take the form of austerity measures, so like cutting public services and the public wage bill, which is spending on public sector wages, essentially, and also measures like introducing taxes which have more harmful impacts on women. There'll be more on that in a minute. So before 2013, the IMF didn't really consider gender equality as a tool related to its work. So even though most, if not all, of its policies have gendered impacts, it basically ignored these impacts in its work and just was like, we don't do gender, that's not what we do, that's got nothing to do with the economy, when obviously we know that to be not the case. But it has started to work on gender in the last few years. So next slide, please, Connie. Here's just a brief timeline of its work. So it started working on gender in 2013 and through to, I'll talk through to now. Next slide again, please. So in 2013, as mentioned, the IMF started to think about how gender relates to its work really for the first time. It produced a discussion note for its staff on the issue of female labour force participation, particularly. So this is a term it uses around the idea that gender gaps in the labour market are what it calls inefficient, and there can be economic gains when there's greater participation from women in the formal labour market. And they then included this advice in 9 countries, to governments of 9 countries in their policy advice, their surveillance. But from the start, there were some clear problems. So firstly, this focus on female labour force participation is a very, very narrow definition of gender equality, which ignores a lot of what Sophie was talking about. But even within this very narrow focus, the IMF was exploring these gaps largely in a vacuum, very detached from the shifts in power relations or the conditions that even would be required to enable women to join the formal labour market, for example, not addressing women's larger share of unpaid care work. Secondly, this was considered to be quite an approach which we call add women and stir, a superficial approach to gender equality, which doesn't challenge the gender dimensions of its own policy advice. So, for example, those policies, those austerity policies I mentioned at the start, often have negative impacts on gender equality, and it wasn't looking or thinking about this. Next slide, please, Connie. So this says feminist critiques of the IMF's approach to gender. So women's groups have long criticized the IMF for its devastating impacts, for the devastating impacts of its programs and policies on women's rights, going back decades. And while the IMF now claims to be doing gender work, as mentioned before, they are still, in fact, undermining women's rights in many ways. And as laid out in the previous slide, from the start, the IMF's approach was really to frame gender or just female labour force participation through the lens of its impact on economic growth. And many feminist groups criticized this as instrumentalizing women's bodies and labour. So that means they felt the IMF was using women as a means to prop up the current economic system, and specifically with female labour force participation, just trying to get more women into a labour force that exploits them, that promotes cheap, precarious and informal labour with little care for improving work standards for women, for example. So rather than trying to create a macroeconomic environment which helps support gender equality. They were just talking about gender equality, but still creating a macroeconomic environment which undermined gender equality. Secondly, ignoring the care economy. So Sophie's already spoken about that, and the role of well-funded public sector, in reducing and redistributing women's heavy and unequal burdens of unpaid care. And the IMF's conventional policy advice, as I mentioned, often cuts back these public services, so shifts that burden back onto women's shoulders, and often restricts their access to public services, increases unpaid care work, but often it's women who work in the public sector. So when they cut the wage bill, cut salaries in the public sector, that often has a disproportionate impact on women, women's employment, their jobs and their salaries, but also these taxes. Bilquis will talk about tax a little bit more after me, but promoting taxes like value-added tax, which disproportionately come out of women's income, and affects women's spending and income. So these policies are kind of the bread and butter policies, we call them, of the IMF, what they often promote to countries. And really, without a radical departure from these, feminist groups argued that the IMF's gender work can only have limited meaning from a feminist perspective. And just to say, this is the reason why a lot of women's rights groups do actually choose not to engage with the IMF at all, because they don't see this as meaningful, while others do. Next slide, please, Connie.
Good morning, brother Reggie.
Thank you.
Hello.
So from the start of this work, civil society groups spent quite a few years demonstrating the ways that these policies, those austerity policies, often have gendered impacts, and really showing that with examples and reports and speaking to officials. And then a breakthrough came in 2018 when the IMF published some guidance to its country staff, so staff that work across the world. And this said that some policies recommended by the IMF may have differential gender impacts that could exacerbate gender inequality. And it said in these instances, staff may consider an alternative policy mix. So this is quite important because it was the first time really that the IMF recognized that its own policy advice can make gender equality worse, can deepen inequalities. And this paragraph, as part of the studies, really represented an opening for groups to try and push the IMF away from those really harmful policies for women's rights. And for women's groups and civil society groups at the national level to show the IMF how its policies undermine women's rights and to propose alternative policies to austerity. And they've also produced some economic modeling, the IMF, to look at the gendered impacts of their policies. So it wasn't perfect, and there were many critiques of this work, but it was a start into looking at, how do their policies do harm? Next slide, please. So throughout all this work, the guiding question for groups working and engaging with the IMF has been, okay, so what is the appropriate role of the IMF in creating an enabling macroeconomic environment for women's rights and gender equality? And because the IMF has historically and continues to this day to promote such harmful policies, civil society really focused not on what the IMF should do, what the IMF should stop doing. So we didn't want the IMF to suddenly become this huge actor in this space. We just wanted them to, as I said, think about the impacts of the policies that they already promote, not start some whole new work. So that's why we really focused on gender impact assessments. So what are those impacts of cutting the wage bill, of imposing different taxes? How do those have different impacts on men and women? And part of this is, as I mentioned, because a real risk is what we call mission creep, where the IMF oversteps the mark and starts working on issues that it's not best place to be working on. where perhaps the UN and other institutions should be working instead. And an example in recent years is the IMF started giving advice on women's access to contraception, linking this to economic growth, which from a feminist perspective, is quite problematic. And women's access to contraception should not be conditional on whether it's good for economic growth or not. So that's where we get into trouble with the IMF taking on too much of this work. And now there are some new challenges to throw into the mix. So the IMF, although we had this breakthrough in 2018, is actually now moving away from this work, and it's back to looking at the impact of gender gaps on GDP, this instrumental approach that I described. And also of real concern is the IMF's really stepped up its lending to countries during the pandemic. And though most of these loans don't have any conditions attached where countries have to commit to particular economic policies, they did require most governments to make commitments around implementing austerity measures in the next few years to show how they were going to pay the money back. So 84% of loans in 2020 have these measures in them, which is very worrying in terms of countries' recovery to the pandemic and the sort of increasing the devastating economic impact that COVID has already had on women and other groups as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this just shows that in the media, the IMF has been using the language of gender equality, but this doesn't really match what it's saying to countries. It's saying that gender is really important in recovery, but countries having to commit to recovery programs, it's requiring them to cut back services. And so I would just end on saying it's more crucial now than ever that groups at the national level point out the difference between what it's saying in the public and in the media and the reality of that in different countries around the world and in the programs and advice that the IMF is promoting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ella. That was really great and helpful. Really great overview of the IMF and its changing approach to gender equality and also the risks associated for how that work is developing in recent years. And to help us really understand how the IMF's work plays out in that way and in practice, we'll turn over to Bilquis Tahira, who will present a case study from Pakistan. Bilquis is a feminist activist and has been part of the women's movement and human rights movement in Pakistan for over 30 decades. She has extensive experience in working on women's concerns nationally and internationally, including violence against women, GBV, and conflict issues, education, engaging men and boys for gender equality and women's empowerment, policy analysis, and policy advocacy. She is the executive director of Shirakat Partnership for Development, a national NGO working on human rights and gender justice in Pakistan, and also a member of the steering committee of Men Engage Alliance Pakistan. Same question to you, Bilquis. What is one word or phrase that comes to mind when you hear macroeconomics and human rights? Go ahead.
Thank you, Connie. This is a very, very interesting question because when I think of, these issues, 3 words come to mind. First one is, neo-colonialism, neoliberalism, and then fundamentalism. This is, I really need to explain this last one because in the global world today, dollar has become God in a way. So if most of the over 90% of decisions are ruled by money and the economy, which means then, power over various, power of the North over the South, all political and economic decisions, even in global politics, are made due to this, capitalistic fundamentalism. I will today talk about, if you can show the presentation, Connie, I will talk about this case study from Pakistan. And to begin with, it's it's really good to contextualize the discussion within Pakistan. And the context actually today is that Pakistan has the third lowest ranking in overall measure of gender-based biases in gender gap report. It's 149 on women's health and survival, 143 on educational attainment, 150 on equal economic participation and opportunity. However, we are lucky that we have gone up a little bit on political empowerment of women, where Pakistan is 93 out of 153 countries in political empowerment of women. Next slide, please. And okay, now the title is really very telling because wherever and Ella and also Sophie have expounded on this, how when IMF goes in, it begins dictating policy of that country. In Pakistan, the loans began in 1950s. In the beginning, very, very small. And since then, we have had 22 loans or facilities, as they are called so far. And the conditionalities that IMF puts in have already been mentioned. But in Pakistan, particularly, this has included a lifting of controls on foreign exchange. So the government then did not have the power to regulate that, encouraging privatization, which then impacts on jobs. There are job cuts, low wages, and particularly impacting women and older women also. Deregulation of business and industry. This was very interesting because we saw in Pakistan that the factories were not allowed by the labor monitors and labor officers. The labor officers were not allowed to visit the industry or a factory without informing them previously. So once I went with them and we were there and we saw this locked hall, and behind the windows we could see these little heads, so because they knew that this monitoring visit was going to take place, they had herded all children into that little hall and they were trying to peep out of it. So, child labor increases, curtailment of public expenditure on social programs. This is part of the austerity measures that Ella has already mentioned and discussed in detail. Devaluation of currency, again, that gives, that actually weakens the economy. The loans are supposed to strengthen your economy, any country's economy, but the policies are totally the opposite of that. And the impact that they have is also totally opposite of the intentions. In and within austerity, then there are budget cuts. There are cuts on subsidies, increases in price of petroleum and electricity. And the moment that happens, transport becomes more expensive, limiting women's mobility. Electricity, then more money spent on electricity means there's less money for household spending, dismantling of price control, so subsidy cuts on various things. Ella has already mentioned regressive taxation. That's also one of the policies. And very recently, we had a discussion with IMF Pakistan talking about the tax reforms, because even though there's a lot of inflation at the moment, and all households, I think the prices of all households, goods and services have gone up. IMF kept insisting on tax reform. And then I have already mentioned austerity measures, which then means reduce social security benefits and pensions, or budget cuts on social sector spending, in the last year, we had only 1% of GDP spending on health and 2.3% of GDP spending on education. So when it goes, with that kind of, I mean, the next is just a picture that I wanted to show you to ground the discussion in the reality of Pakistan. And this is not a far-flung rural area. This is part of Islamabad, the capital. The next slide, Connie, which is then on impact. And what has happened is that more and more girls are out of school. And we used to have a few years ago, there were about 29% of girls in primary school age out of school. And now there are 32% girls out of school, only 21% of boys at that age. I shouldn't even say only, because they have as much a right to get education as girls are, but even that discrimination can be seen here. Access to healthcare is very limited for women and girls, and becomes more limited as mobility cost goes up, as other there are other competitive needs in the household for women, and particularly older women and girls. It becomes really, really limited and competitive. Then, because of the privatization, deregulation, etc., more women are pushed into informal labor because there are job cuts. The social protection mechanisms that we have are really, very narrowly targeted. So they leave a number of women out of that, out of the ambit of the social protection. And overall, again, I would say, the aim is continuously said that it is, reduce the poverty. However, it changes the face, and the poverty then becomes a woman's face. Similarly, I have talked a little bit about regressive taxation, but it makes it very difficult for women to manage household budgets, and eventually it's girls' needs that take the lower priority. Increased child labor, I've already mentioned. Expensive travel, also curtailing, women's mobility. Higher energy costs, contracting women's work at home. So home-based workers, even if they are, working on tailoring or doing other craft, craft-related work. If it means, because they don't have time during the day, if it means that they have to work at night, the energy costs are very, very, disturbing there. And before I go further on the work that we are doing, we as Shirakat are doing, I just want to share two anecdotes with you. There was a conflict, needs assessment in Pakistan. Conflict needs assessment. And I was from UN Women, I was part of the social protection group that was working on that. And we had even so many fights with the World Bank on the language, on the wording. They were not willing to accept the social protection definition that the government uses and the CSOs and the activists use. For them, social protection was equal to cash transfer. At the end of it all, after we had, banged our heads against the wall for many days, we came to know that the World Bank had already signed a contract with the government of Pakistan, so it's state collusion as well, for a cash transfer, unconditional cash transfer program. The papers had already been signed, and they were using us as a rubber stamp to, to approve that, post, not humorously, but really post-datedly, retroactively approve, the work that they were trying to do. Although we were talking about cash for work, cash for education, etc., and they would not, in the end. The second one is, we were, I call myself very naive. In the 90s, when the first poverty reduction strategy paper was done, I was part from Canadian CEDA. I was part of an interagency gender and development group. It's called NGAD and has been working a number of years, for the past 40 years in Pakistan. And we spent nights trying to integrate, give comments to the government and to the donors and the World Bank to include gender equality, various aspects of gender equality within that. Now I realize, for the past 3 years, when we began working on, global economy and macroeconomic frameworks, etc., I realized that this was really PRSPs, poverty reduction strategy papers, were a strategy used by IMF to cover structural adjustment programs which were receiving a lot of criticism from feminists and from social development activists. There are several other, anecdotes, but I'll stop the anecdoting there. What we have been doing so far is here in Pakistan engaging with IMF for, to talking about conducting a gender analysis of all of their programs and a political analysis. Because, now the current government and in the past previous governments faced a lot of flack from people when there was more inflation, when people found it difficult to make ends meet. So there's no political analysis of what kind of political implications these programs will have. We have been trying to work with parliamentarians on, negotiating and renegotiating with IMF the conditionalities. We built alliances with media, social media campaigns, and we are liaising with various think tanks as well. I mean, one could go on and on and on, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Connie, I was on the next slide, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No problem at all. No problem.
I was listening too intently and forgot about the slides.
No problem. Over to you, Constanza.
Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation and really helpful to get a sense of what this kind of advocacy looks like at the national level and the impact it really has on everyday lives of women. So thank you so much for bringing that into the conversation. And now we'd really like to take the opportunity to move to a Q&A. I'm just going to switch myself to gallery view. And hear from all of you in terms of your experiences, your questions to the speakers, however it is that you'd like to engage. We'd really love the chance to deepen this discussion with all of you. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat or raise your hand. And thank you everyone for introducing yourselves so far. And I do see one comment from Audrey, who I may pick on if she's up for turning on her mic. Audrey says, at some point in the past, WROs, women's rights organizations, were quite positive about aid conditionalities which focused on gender commitments. Is there anything you wanted to expand on that, or what has changed since then, or any questions for the speakers based on that experience, Audrey, if she's still in the room?
Hi, Connie. Hi, everyone. Thank you for giving me the space to speak. I was really interested to hear about, the nature of aid conditionalities. Like, what are we seeing now in terms of the impact? When earlier when we were engaging like 10 years ago on the question of aid conditionalities as an entry point to move very difficult gender issues with some of the developing countries. The rhetoric was that these were useful tools in our toolbox, but I think maybe from what you're saying, things have changed from since then. So I was just interested to hear more about how that's working now.
Thank you, Audrey. And I think any of the speakers could probably answer that, but I don't know if any of you really wants to jump in, or Ella or Bilquis, since you've spoken specifically about the IMF. I leave it to your discretion to see which speaker wants to jump in.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Audrey, for that question. And I think a really interesting question, and one that's always challenging for women's rights groups, is, how much to support, I guess, positive conditionalities where loans are coming from, well, I would say primarily the World Bank. In the case of the IMF, I guess we wouldn't necessarily call it aid because it's strictly loans that countries will have to pay back. But with the World Bank, there is more of aid or grant financing. But still, I guess the central question is, how much do we focus on that doing harm aspect, and how much do women's rights groups kind of accept when there are potentially more positive conditions attached? So the IMF has previously required countries to commit to, for example, I guess, expanding nursery care or things like this. And I don't have the answer, and I can't say I speak to that, but I would say, we felt that it's important really to focus our work on those harmful impacts of the conventional policy, rather than focusing so much on areas where there might be so-called positive gender conditionalities. But I would be interested if anyone has any other thoughts on that, or anyone from women's rights groups has a different opinion, for example. But that's been kind of our focus, and it's interesting, that you were saying that women's groups, were perhaps more supportive of that 10 years ago. And I think, particularly we've seen the IMF promoting austerity measures post the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. So I think, those austerity policies have become the real focus of civil society. And sadly, we're seeing the same thing again with COVID-19 loans.
Thank you, Ella. And I saw that Sophie was going to add something too, and we haven't heard from you in a while. So if you want to jump in, please do.
Okay, sure. And it was very quickly to say about, Ella has already brilliantly addressed the point. I think it's just further to add, especially from a UK perspective, if we're talking about aid or loans with particular conditionalities, there is this belief certainly that it should be deemed a good thing, that it has gender commitments to it. I think the question for us is, who is making those decisions about what these gender commitments are? Are they appropriate? Are they suitable for the particular circumstances? And I think sometimes as well, this focus on, are the mechanics within these institutions working well, sometimes has the potential to distract from the bigger, broader question about, if we're wanting to decolonize our relationships between global North and global South, rethink the ways in which our economies work, then I guess the question is that, should these aid conditionalities or any kind of aid be provided full stop? And is there something else, a reimagined version of our global economies that need to be created that don't rely on these institutions for us to be able to especially for developing countries, to be able to run their global economies? And even here, for example, in the UK context, specifically in relation to aid, where the UK government has historically assigned dedicated portions of its aid spend on promoting and advancing gender equality, which we've seen completely and utterly gutted over this last year, it kind of, it reiterates the point of what is it that we're asking governments to do, what it originally had been doing before about its commitments to promoting gender equality were good and fine enough, but we were still entrenched in this system where loans and aids were still being provided to developing countries. And I think it's that question of trying to say, well, actually, do we need to reimagine and move further and beyond that to rethink about, a global economic system that doesn't rely on these kind of mechanisms and institutions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All really important points. Go ahead, Bilquis.
Yeah, I'm the storyteller here in the session. In terms of looking at, these, particularly with the World Bank, because it has a system of conducting a gender analysis. And a few years ago, there was a strategy after, a humanitarian crisis in Malakand division, and they did a PSIA. Okay, that happened. A donor trust fund was created. We pushed to have 30% at least allocated to women and girls, and including older women as well. After 3 years, when we did an analysis, we came to know that only 3% had gone to gender equality and women's rights. Then in the same program, in the same program, after 5 years, there was a phase 2. So when we went and, did an analysis of their documents, for the phase 2, they had not done a gender analysis at all. And there was one line instead which said, since the situation remains the same, we have not done this analysis. So please tell me, what were you doing for 5 years there if the situation remains the same? So, these are really, bringing these policy matters to the ground when we try to see how they have impacted the situation on the ground. It seems, a lot of times, it seems really, really disappointing. The last point I would say is, now here in Pakistan, we make a comparison of the GSP plus status that the European Union has given Pakistan. And in their indicators, there are several very useful pressure points that we can use to push the government for our advocacy on women's rights, on child rights, on elderly women's rights, and for gender equality. While if we look at the IMF programs, even the World Bank programs, the commitments and that they want on gender equality, let's accept it. These are commercial organizations. They have to survive, and they have to survive on us, on the percentages that they get from countries which are using their loans, whether they are, IMF loans or, soft loans from the World Bank, even if it's 2%. So, it's when one looks at all of these things, and particularly on the ground, how these things pan out, I'm sorry, but there's very little positive comment that I can make on that. Over to you.
Thank you. That was a great discussion, which is why we love the Q&A. So if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to jump in the chat or raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you, or even sharing your own experiences with advocacy relating to macroeconomics and gender equality, or questions about how to make those connections.
Oh, just very quickly, Connie, I see Audrey has put something in the chat on how to make, how to make sure that IMF is accountable to human rights agenda. I have been in their two of their meetings, annual and spring meetings, from a distance. And whenever we ask them, IMF says it's not their mandate. It's World Bank's mandate to look after human rights, And and we have quoted back to them that the way IMF was created, like IOM and like ILO, it's mandatory on them to conform to CEDAW, to conform to UDHR, to conform to ISCA and other conventions, etc. But the response that they give back to us is, it's not our mandate, it's World Bank's mandate. So how to hold them accountable is, I would say, Audrey, through social pressure that CSOs can bring on them, coalitions, etc. Over to you, Connie.
Thank you for catching that. And yes, please go ahead, Ella.
Yeah, just building on what Bilquis was saying there, it is challenging because the IMF does see itself as somewhat removed from human rights obligations, even though it has such a big impact on countries' ability to fulfill their human rights obligations, and often undermines that. But last year, the former UN independent expert on foreign debt and human rights did issue a report which argued that international financial institutions can be held responsible in international law for complicity with economic reforms that violate human rights. And in that, he said, in principle, austerity policies during times of recession are incompatible with obligations to guarantee the enjoyment of human rights. And he also said, although states are the main guarantors of human rights, international financial institutions can also be held responsible if they are complicit in prescribing policies with probable negative impacts on human rights. And this kind of follows some guiding principles on human rights impact assessments of economic reforms, which came out, which was submitted to the Human Rights Council in 2019. Around how the institutions violate economic, social, and cultural rights. So there is the framework there. It's hard to do in reality. And IWRAW have been doing amazing work with CEDAW on this issue. But yeah, it is quite challenging, and it is always an argument and not necessarily an automatic. But I would just say, and I can put these in the chat as well, in Tunisia, they had a Truth and Dignity Commission, which actually did write a memorandum to the World Bank and the IMF seeking reparations for human rights violations linked to economic policies. And that was quite an interesting case. And although it didn't necessarily go anywhere, it was an example of a state trying to hold the institutions to account for their role in undermining and violating human rights.
Thank you, Ella, for those great examples. And I know I see people in the room who also have a lot of experience engaging in all kinds of advocacy relating to holding IFIs accountable for women's human rights and gender-just macroeconomics. So I invite you to please join in at any time if there's any experiences or strategies that you want to share in terms of what you found to be effective, or different linkages that you think are still left to be made.
Connie, can I ask pose a question to one of the panelists?
Of course, yes, please do.
If I may. So I was just reflecting on what Ella had mentioned about what came out from Tunisia, the push for reparatory justice from Tunisians as a response to IMF policies. And I wonder, because that was in 2019, and I guess it's just a question of, although it, as you said, it didn't necessarily go anywhere, I wonder if that same proposal had been put out, like let's say this year or last year, when these calls for global reparations or a better understanding about reparations means in the context of, Black Lives Matter, in the context of decolonization, etc. Do you think that might have made a difference, or are you sensing that there are any other institutions or any other organizations that are doing similar kind of work anywhere else in the world?
Thank you very much for the question, Sophie. And yeah, great to sort of, think about if that, would have had more of an impact when there was more of a common understanding about concepts like reparations coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement last year in particular. The honest answer is I don't know, but and particularly with this case being quite, I guess, specific around some of the social unrest in Tunisia. But I think it's interesting, to reframe that now. And I haven't seen anything come out recently. But I think, particularly in that context and in the post-COVID context, I think that would be really interesting to see. And if there are any other groups on the call who, have been thinking about that work, that would be really interesting to hear of. But I personally haven't seen anything to that effect. We have seen some negotiations, particularly between civil society groups in Costa Rica around the IMF's policy reforms, but we haven't seen anything with regards to, reparations for past injustices. So that's an interesting conversation, and I think it would be interesting to see if that, anything does come out of that, and particularly given the current context as well, and that some of these discussions are becoming more mainstream. Thanks for the question.
Yes, thank you both. And this actually brought to mind for me broader questions around democratic participation in the kinds of economic issues that we've been talking about within these policymaking institutions at national and international levels. And the issue that came to mind, I'm not sure if anyone in the room has experience with this, is sovereign debt audits and democratic participations in those kinds of procedures and how they relate to international financial institutions. And if anyone has explored that as a mechanism for accountability, for, as I said, enhancing democratic participation and accountability for these institutions. And if not, that's okay. It can be just a question in the wind and something for all of us to explore later on. Thank you, Rose, for dropping in the chat box a austerity research. And of course, yes, Rose, go ahead, please jump in.
Hi, everyone. Oh, let me see if my camera works. Yeah, it does. I just wanted to share that austerity research in relation to sort of the longevity in which IMF and World Bank institutions have been influencing policy around the world. And I think what really struck me about this research and some others in a session I attended last week, so I didn't do this research just to be upfront about that, I just thought it was relevant for the space, that really, fiscal contraction and reducing spending on public services actually is consistently happening since the 80s. So even when we talk about austerity and like really, flag that less and less spending is going to happen now, even though we're in a global pandemic and you think we should spend more on health systems, it is happening already for a really long time. So I think linking back to that question on conditionality, I think these institutions are not fit for purpose to say anything about what we should do when it comes to gender equality or women's rights. So I would be very hesitant to say that any conditionality should come from these institutions, and really, these decisions should be made on a national level, consulted with women's rights groups of diverse backgrounds. So I was just trying to make that link to that conditionality question. But thank you so much for this session.
That was a really important point. Thank you, Rose, for linking us back to our original question. We just have a couple minutes left, so if anyone has anything else they'd like to raise or ask about, or examples of their own, especially national level advocacy, since that's something that Rose helpfully brought up, please feel free to take the floor. Otherwise, I know that we all are attending still various Zoom sessions and online meetings, so I don't want to keep you in this room for too long, and really appreciate you choosing to join us today. So we can give it over to the speakers again for a last word, maybe in the same order as the beginning, to say any last comments you want to make, or calls to action, or anything for helping us to move this work forward. Please jump in now. Sophie, we can start with you.
Thanks, Connie, and thanks also to IWRAW, to BWP, to Shirakat for organizing this session. And I hope it has been a helpful way to introduce a lot of people who might not have been familiar with questions about macroeconomics, and who have an interest in gender equality, about the ways in which those two systems interact, and the kind of consequences and in some instances harm that it can cause. So and also just certainly it's been my first time at this symposium attending, and it's just really good to be able to connect with other people who aren't, this isn't necessarily an area of work that you might have been introduced to or have been working on, but I hope it's been an opportunity to kind of get your get your interest up in wanting to understand these issues more, and certainly reading through all the various materials, etc., that have been shared in the link, because there's so much work that's happening about this, and it's not necessarily front and center all the time, but it's a really important work that is taking place by many feminists around the world. So I just wanted to make that point. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Ella, your final word.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of follow on from some of the discussions and what the report that Rose put in the chat. I think there's a real urgency at the moment around these issues, as we're seeing, gender equality has obviously been hugely exacerbated by the COVID-19, gender inequality hugely exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the sort of recession following it. But the fact that we're seeing so many countries committing to really harmful austerity measures in the next few years when they're meant to be recovering from the pandemic is so worrying. And the fact that, the IMF, the central institution here, is promoting that with, limited attention really to that is just very concerning for over the next few years. So I would just say, as much as groups can or are able to look at, what the IMF is doing either in your country or area, region, or globally, and speak to, as much as you can, representatives to hold them to account, because they are accountable to you, even if they don't act like it.
Thank you, Ella. Bilquis, you want to close us off?
Yes, thank you very much. All I want to say at the end is, it's very important for all of us to come together, to think things through together, to campaign together, and to be, to be on the same page with our activism. Because I believe that without feminist activism, women's rights groups activism, what kind of power do we have? Very little, in terms of when I look at trillions that, IMF has, and the same kind of money that World Bank has, and money speaks. So I think it's important to raise our voices together so that we can make some, change and try and hold these mammoth elephants, responsible and accountable. I also would like to thank all participants to be here, and please feel free to get in touch with us over email, because you've received, invitations. Thank you very much to Bretton Woods Project, to IWRAW, and to GetNet to collaborate with us on this. Please go to the Global Symposium website, Ubuntu Symposium website. There are several other sessions happening, and the closing session will be happening on 22nd of June. So we would like, all of you, you can pick and choose sessions. There's this Zoom fatigue with all of us, or meet fatigue. So I would urge you to at least see what interests you and to be part of that. So thank you everyone for being here. I really enjoyed this space and I really enjoyed discussion. And let's continue talking. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that closing, and thank you to all the speakers, all the organizations, and the session organizers and the symposium for bringing us together. It was really great to be here with you all. Have a good night.
Bye.